Good morning, afternoon, or night. This is my topic proposal presentation. My name is Ashley Jackson in Research Methods and Behavior on November 15th, 2025. My topic is the effects of crime media. Does regular exposure lead to desensitization? Crime media has become one of the most popular genres today. Everything from true crime podcasts to documentaries, crime-focused TikToks, news stories, and dramatized TV series. Because of how accessible it is, many young adults consume violent or crime-related content multiple times a week without even really noticing it. But research shows this type of exposure doesn't just entertain us. It can influence how we think and feel about violence. Some studies suggest that repeated exposure may lead to desensitization, meaning people feel less emotional impact when they see violence. Others show the opposite, though: more fear, more anxiety, and even increased empathy for victims. So there's not a clear answer just yet, and that uncertainty is exactly why this topic is important. This matters in real life because emotional reactions to violence influences things like mental health, empathy, and even decision-making. It's especially relevant for people who enter fields like law enforcement, psychology, or forensic work when dealing with violence is common. One article I reviewed by Miron Juarez et al. 2022 found that exposure to violent news increased anxiety by raising people's perception of risk. So even though their focus was news rather than entertainment crime media, it showed that violent content can meaningfully shift emotional states. Silva and Guedes 2022 also extended this through a qualitative study where participants described feeling more fearful, cautious, or emotionally reactive when exposed to frequent crime portrayals. This adds a more human perspective to the emotional impact. On the other hand, Guo 2022 and Tahir, Lubna, and Ahmer 2022 both found evidence that frequent exposure to violent media can lead to emotional blunting and lower empathy, especially among younger audiences. Tahir et al. Even found that aggression and reduced emotional sensitivity were strongly linked to viewing content involving fighting and property destruction. Together, these studies show that media exposure does change emotional reactions, but the direction varies depending on context, type of media, and individual differences. That inconsistency is the gap. We still don't know how real-life crime media affects the emotional responses in young adults, the audience that consumes it most. Now, my research question focuses specifically on young adults who regularly consume crime media. I want to know whether the frequency of their crime media consumption predicts their level of emotional desensitization over time. Because the literature shows mixed emotional outcomes, some studies show numbness while others show fear, it's important to investigate which pattern here is most common among this demographic. My hypothesis is that the more frequently someone consumes crime media, the more likely they are to report emotional desensitization. This is supported by Guo 2022 and Tahir et al. 2022, who found that repeated exposure to violent content was linked to reduced emotional responses and lower empathy. But I'm also keeping in mind that emotional reactions can go in different directions, which is why I'm using a correlational design rather than assuming a specific causal relationship. In terms of participants, I'm focusing on young adults between ages 18 and 30 who already consume crime media. This group is ideal because research shows that young adults heavily engage with true crime podcasts, streaming shows, and social media crime content. A sample size of around 200 to 300 participants is realistic and provides enough power for a correlational analysis, as suggested by the sample size reasoning in Jangiani et al. 2019. I would recruit participants through college campuses, social media platforms, and online communities dedicated to crime media. Inclusion criteria would include regular consumption of crime media, at least 1 to 2 hours per week. Exclusion criteria would include individuals under 18 or anyone who might be at risk of distress from violent material. The goal is to capture a diverse sample of real, everyday crime media consumers. For this correlational study, the predictor variable, also known as the independent variable, is the frequency of crime media exposure. I'm operationalizing this as hours per week spent watching, listening to, or reading crime-related content. This is consistent with the textbook guidance on turning abstract constructs into measurable variables. The outcome variable, also known as the dependent variable, is emotional desensitization to violence. I'll measure this by using self-report scales where participants indicate how emotionally impacted they feel by short descriptions of violent scenarios. Lower emotional ratings would reflect higher desensitization. I'm also accounting for potential confounding variables like empathy, prior exposure to real violence, baseline anxiety, and age. These can influence emotional responses independent of media exposure, so controlling for them makes the results more meaningful. Defining and measuring these variables clearly is essential to ensuring the study produces valid and interpretable data. For this study, I'm using a cross-sectional correlational design because manipulating exposure to violent content would be unethical, and the goal is simply to examine existing relationships. The measure would include demographic questions, a scale assessing hours per week of crime media exposure, empathy and anxiety scales, and brief violent scenarios where participants rate their emotional reactions. This approach aligns with guidance from Jhangiani et al. 2019 on measuring psychological constructs in non-experimental research. The procedure is straightforward. Participants will first give online consent, then complete a 20 to 30-minute survey. A subset of participants will have the option to complete a follow-up interview lasting about 15 minutes, which allows for richer, more subjective descriptions similar to the approach used by Silva and Geddes 2022. For our analysis, I would run correlations and regression models to see whether exposure frequencies predict emotional reaction scores, controlling for the confounding variables I listed earlier. This study is highly feasible because it relies on online surveys, which are inexpensive and easy to distribute. Crime media consumers are everywhere, so recruitment should be straightforward. Ethically, the study follows the principles described by Jhangiani et al. 2019. Participants will receive informed consent information, they'll be warned about potentially disturbing content, and they can skip any questions or withdraw at any time. At the end of the survey, I'll provide mental health resources and a debriefing explanation. Since the study doesn't expose participants to new violent images or videos and only uses tech-based scenarios, the risk is minimal. The safeguards ensure that participants feel comfortable throughout the process. This study fills a meaningful gap in research by focusing specifically on young adults and their exposure to real-life crime media, not fictional violence and not children or adolescents. Understanding whether frequent exposure leads to desensitization can help guide media literacy programs, mental health recommendations, and even training for careers that might involve exposure to violence. For example, if heavy crime media consumption reduces emotional sensitivity, that might affect empathy or decision-making in fields like policing or psychology. On the other hand, if exposure increases vigilance or emotional awareness, that also has important implications. Either outcomes would help us understand how modern media habits shape emotional well-being. One limitation of the study is that a correlational design cannot show causation. Even if I find a strong relationship between exposure and desensitization, I can't say that one causes the other. It is also possible that people who are already less emotionally reactive seek out crime media more often. Another limitation is self-report bias. Participants might underreport or overreport their media habits or emotional responses. The sample will also be a convenience sample, which may not represent all young adults. For next steps, future research could include a longitudinal design to track emotional reactions over time, which would help clarify potential causal pathways. Studies could also test media literacy interventions to see if they reduce negative emotional effects. Finally, expanding to different cultural groups would help us understand how contexts influence emotional responses to violence. And finally, we have our references. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one.